26-year-old female who's fascinated by the paranormal, but I didn't always believe in it. I was open to the idea, but didn't put much stock into it. Over the years, that's drastically changed. When my wife and I were newlyweds, we were best friends with another couple. We would travel together, go on double dates. One day, they went out of town and we agreed to watch their animals. They had a cat, a bearded dragon, a red iguana, and 2 rats. Since I worked near their home, I'd go over in the morning, during my lunch hour, and again in the evening. I was usually alone for the morning and afternoon visits, and my wife would join me for the evening visit. One day during the afternoon visit, I purposely left the lights off because there was enough natural light to see fairly well without them, and I wanted to save a little on their electric bill. I did not touch the lights. After checking on the animals, I returned to work. When my wife and I came back that evening, the outside entryway and hallway lights were both on. I told my wife I was 100% sure I hadn't done it. She thought that someone from their HOA or a relative had stopped by. Or someone had noticed they were out of town and broke in. We each put a car key between our knuckles and entered the house. It was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear any of the animals, and the air felt stale. I could have choked on it. We slowly made our way through the house, looking for any sign of disturbance, and every single light was on. But nothing was out of place. We both relaxed somewhat. I began gaslighting myself into believing that I had somehow turned on all of the lights. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the reptile room, the one that we had just left, and it was so loud that the house shook. We threw open the door, but nothing had moved, not even an inch. The only thing that had changed was the bearded dragon. Its large enclosure was on the floor and had a sliding glass door in front of it. The dragon, who had been peacefully resting just a minute before, was now rhythmically tapping his nose against the glass, over and over again. It was almost robotic. I stared in disbelief. I'd never seen an animal behave like that. I walked to the enclosure, gently sliding the glass door open, and the dragon continued to tap on the glass that wasn't there, before its beard suddenly went pitch black. Then it scrambled out of the enclosure and straight for the exit. Luckily, my wife was able to close the door in time, but once he reached it, he started tapping on it in the same pattern that he had been doing on the glass. Suddenly, on the other side of the door, we heard another, even louder thud, followed immediately by the cat screaming. It was horrible. But I didn't have time to react before we heard clanging and clattering in the other enclosures behind us. The iguana was wildly whipping its tail against the sides and hissing. It was terrifying. I quickly returned the dragon to its enclosure, and he immediately resumed tapping. My wife grabbed the doorknob. I'll never forget the fear and disbelief in her voice when she said that it wouldn't open. I rushed over and started yanking as hard as I could, but the knob wouldn't even turn. It wasn't broken. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I banged on it, screaming as true panic set in. My head was fuzzy, my chest was tight, and I thought I would pass out. Then, it suddenly all stopped. The cat fell silent. The iguana stopped whipping. The dragon stopped tapping, and the door opened easily. When we left that room, the rest of the lights were now off. My wife and I bolted outside and remained silent the whole way home. The next day, I'd almost convinced myself that it was a fluke, that the animals had upset each other. When I told my friend about the weird experience, she replied, "Oh, I
forgot to mention, we've had a lot of activity lately.
What do you mean by activity? I asked. She then explained that the former owner, an elderly man, had passed away in the home after owning it for 40 years. Ever since they started the renovations, she'd been seeing a male figure in the corners or at the bottom of the stairs. He would rile up the animals and mess with the lights, but he'd never been violent. Only mischievous, as he was upset about the renovations. After that, I reevaluated my outlook on the paranormal, and now I sure as hell believe. In the 3rd grade, I had an experience where I lost a chunk of time. 4 months later, things were mostly back to normal, except I started having trouble sleeping. Sometimes I would just lay there, wide awake for up to 6 hours, and it eventually wore me down. My parents took me to a doctor who said the issue was probably related to scary movies and late-night TV, which was obviously not the case. I wasn't even allowed to watch that kind of stuff. Regardless, my parents became even more strict with screen time, and I was given herbal tea before bed. Minimizing my screen time was one of the most frustrating things I experienced in my adolescence, so when my family went to sleep, I snuck in the living room. I was too afraid to turn on the TV, so I looked out the window instead. I usually didn't see anything exciting, but one evening, I saw my dad's best friend, Tony, standing on the sidewalk right outside of our apartment. It seemed very odd, like he was waiting for me. As soon as I pulled the curtain back, he was staring directly at me, smiling and waving. He was one of the first friends my parents met when they came to America. So I always knew him as Uncle Tony. He would usually slip me $20 when he came to visit, so I always made sure to greet him first. I gestured for him to come upstairs, and the moment I turned to unlock the door, there was a faint knock, so I quickly opened it. I invited him inside and offered to wake my dad as I brought an extra chair from the kitchen. Tony walked in, smiling, and I hurried to my parents' room. They were already sitting up asking if I opened the front door, to which I proudly announced that Uncle Tony was here. Dad ran to the living room to find the door open and the kitchen chair in the middle of the room. He was furious and he wanted answers, but I thought Tony had just gone downstairs to get something. After confirming that wasn't the case, Dad locked up and sent me to bed. I was so confused. I didn't know if I'd been dreaming or sleepwalking, but I knew better than to argue with Dad right then. I woke up at 10 in the morning, hoping Dad would leave for work before I had to face him, but I could hear my parents talking. Mom was crying, and Dad was on the phone. I came out of my room. Mom called me into the living room. She asked if I really saw Uncle Tony the previous night. Her eyes were red and puffy. When I said yes, she looked at my father in pure astonishment. Dad sat next to me and explained that Uncle Tony couldn't have been here because he passed away in a car accident on his way home from Tijuana. I burst into tears for many reasons. Even as I write this, my throat tightens because I loved him. He was like family. My parents gave me a look that was very sad, serious, and a little frightened all at the same time. And they said, if I see Tony again, to tell him we all love him and miss him. I never did see him again, but I think about him often. I did, however, realize that if I could see Uncle Tony, I might be able to see other spirits as well. I don't believe in heaven or hell, but I do believe there is an existence after this one. And all these years later, I'm still discovering new things. Of the many encounters I've had since, some entities were innocuous, and some were absolutely horrifying.